Everyone knows South Park as the show that tore up the rulebook. Cruder than Springfield, faster, meaner. The show that made The Simpsons look safe. Then South Park's own creators spent an entire episode admitting something nobody expected them to admit. And that is exactly why, in this video, we're going to prove The Simpsons was right about South Park. The 10-year head start. On the night of August 13th, 1997, a cable channel that most American households barely noticed put 4 badly drawn children on a bus stop bench in a snowy Colorado town and let them talk about an alien probe. The episode was called Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, and it was built almost entirely out of construction paper, glue, and stop-motion photography because the 2 men who made it had no series contract and no real budget to work with. On the same night, over on Fox, The Simpsons was preparing to enter its 9th season on television, sitting on nearly 180 finished episodes, a merchandising empire, and a decade of cultural weight that no animated series in American history had ever accumulated before. That gap is where this whole story begins. 2 evenly matched programs did not walk into the same open space together. One of them had already spent 10 years claiming almost every idea an adult cartoon could reasonably claim, and the other one arrived late to a room where most of the furniture had already been bought and arranged. The Simpsons did not begin as a half-hour program. The family first appeared as short filler segments on The Tracy Ullman Show starting in 1987, tiny animated interruptions squeezed between live-action comedy sketches. Those shorts were rough, oddly proportioned, and strange to look at, but they worked well enough that Fox eventually gave the family its own series. The full show launched on December 17, 1989, with a Christmas episode called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, and from that point forward, the series expanded at a speed that left almost no corner of American life untouched. By the middle of the 90s, The Simpsons had already produced the specific episodes that would matter enormously to this story, though nobody watching them at the time would have guessed why. In February 1990, barely 2 months into the show's run, an episode called The Telltale Head aired, in which Bart sawed the head off a statue of the town founder. In January 1993, the show aired Marge vs. the Monorail, a story about a smooth-talking salesman conning an entire town into buying a train it did not need. In May 1995, the show closed its 6th season with Mr. Burns unveiling a machine designed to block out the sun over Springfield. In October 1996, a Halloween segment showed Lisa accidentally creating a tiny civilization inside a petri dish and being worshipped as a god by the creatures living in it. 4 episodes, spread across 7 years, all of them buried inside a much larger catalog of stories about school, church, work, marriage, and small-town politics. Nobody involved in making them treated any of them as a landmark. They were simply episodes, produced on a schedule, aired, and then followed by more episodes the next week. Their real importance would only become visible years later, inside a completely different show, made by 2 men who had not yet sold a single television program to anyone. The scale of what Springfield had already used up by 1997 is easy to underestimate. 8 completed seasons, running at roughly 22 episodes each, meant something close to 180 finished half hours of television. Almost every one of those episodes carried a main story and a secondary story running underneath it, which effectively doubled the number of premises the writers had burned through. Alongside all of that came the annual Halloween specials, each one packing 3 separate self-contained horror stories into a single episode, which meant another 20 or so complete premises consumed in the space of a few hours of screen time. All of that together makes the picture clear. By the time South Park existed, The Simpsons had already told stories about religion, politics, environmental collapse, corporate greed, celebrity worship, school failure, alcoholism, gambling, cults, aliens, time travel, nuclear accidents, political assassination attempts, monorails, and a talking statue of a town founder. It had put its characters in space, in prison, in Australia, in the mob, in the army, and inside a computer-generated third dimension. The show had run so long and moved so fast that it functioned less like a television program and more like an enormous filing cabinet of American comedy premises, with a fresh drawer added every September. That was the situation The Simpsons occupied culturally as well. Bart Simpson had been a national merchandising phenomenon at the start of the decade, plastered across t-shirts that schools banned outright. The show had collected armfuls of awards, spawned a small industry of academic writing, and become the default reference point for anyone discussing what animation could do for adult audiences. Fox had built a substantial portion of its identity as a network on the back of one yellow family, and executives across the industry had spent years trying to reverse engineer whatever it was that made the thing work. Trey Parker and Matt Stone met while studying at the University of Colorado, and their earliest work together looked nothing like a professional pitch. In 1992, they made a crude animated short, usually referred to as Jesus vs. Frosty, using paper cutouts photographed frame by frame, featuring early versions of characters who would later become recognizable to millions of people. The short was short, ugly, violent, and funny in a way that made it hard to forget once seen. 3 years later, a Fox executive named Brian Graydon saw that first short and paid the two of them to make another one, this time as a video Christmas card he could send to friends in the industry. The result was a second short built around a fight between Jesus and Santa Claus, and this version looked much closer to the series that eventually followed. Graydon had copies made and handed them out, and the tape began moving through Hollywood the way a rumor moves through a small office. People duplicated it. People passed it along. Copies eventually spread across the early internet at a moment when almost nobody was watching video online at all, and the short became one of the first widely shared hits in that format. That word of mouth is what put Parker and Stone in front of Comedy Central. It also explains why the show that resulted looked the way it did. The pilot was animated using the same handmade cutout method as the shorts, without the computer assistance that the series would later rely on, which meant the finished product carried a homemade roughness that no network would have designed on purpose. Before Comedy Central, other networks had looked at the pitch and passed. Matt Stone later explained the reasoning behind those rejections directly. They had pitched a show about 4 little boys living in a town, and executives kept telling them that audiences would only watch an animated program built around a family. That was the shape the industry believed in at the time, and the reason the industry believed in it was sitting right there on Fox every Sunday night, drawing enormous ratings and printing money. So The Simpsons had shaped the market that South Park had to enter, twice over. It proved that adults would watch animation in prime time, and it simultaneously narrowed everyone's imagination about what such a show could look like. The doors were open, but they were only open a certain width, and the width had been set by Springfield. Comedy Central executive Doug Herzog, the man who greenlit the series and put that first episode on the air in August 1997, later described the appeal in simple terms, saying there was nothing else like it on television. That was true in terms of tone and language. In terms of structure, though, South Park arrived carrying a great deal of inherited machinery: a small American town with a fixed cast of local eccentrics, a school with a recognizable staff, parents whose stupidity drove entire plots, a cast of children who commented on adult behavior from below. Every one of those elements had been running on Fox for the better part of a decade. The overlap goes deeper than a shared setting. Both shows built their worlds around a fictional American town with elastic geography, capable of containing a nuclear plant, a mountain range, a shopping mall, or an entire foreign country whenever a story needed one. Both filled that town with a rotating bench of local characters who existed mainly to be pulled out for a single scene and dropped back in place afterward. Both put an incompetent authority figure behind a school desk and an even more incompetent authority figure behind a police badge. Both centered a child protagonist whose defining trait was a refusal to accept what adults told him. None of this made South Park a copy in any meaningful sense. The voice was completely different, the pacing was different, the willingness to end an episode on cruelty rather than warmth was entirely its own. Springfield sent its audience home with something soft most weeks. South Park almost never did, but the load-bearing walls of the two houses were built to a similar plan, and that similarity would eventually become the subject of an entire episode of television. Parker and Stone have never been shy about where their own instincts actually came from, and their answer has stayed consistent across decades of interviews. The show that made them believe they could make a cartoon was Beavis and Butthead, which arrived on MTV in 1993 with a handmade, low-effort feeling that felt reachable to two young filmmakers with no animation training. Parker has said plainly that they never sat down watching The Simpsons and thought that they could do that. The Simpsons looked like an institution. Beavis and Butthead looked like something two guys could build in a room. That distinction matters for everything that followed. Parker and Stone did not set out to copy Springfield, and there is no evidence anywhere that they ever tried to. They came from live-action filmmaking, they met in film school, and their comedic instincts ran towards shock, music, and long-form storytelling rather than the dense joke layering that defined The Simpsons at its peak. Their debt to Springfield was structural and accidental rather than intentional, which is exactly the kind of debt that becomes impossible to argue with later. None of that resemblance was hidden from the people making the newer show, and none of it embarrassed them either. Working inside a shape somebody else established is what almost every television writer does, since the formats available at any given moment are the formats the industry is currently willing to buy. The interesting question was never whether the shape was borrowed, it was what got poured into it. The early production reality made the gap even wider. The Simpsons operated inside a full network animation pipeline, with episodes taking many months to complete, overseas animation houses, table reads, and a writing staff deep enough to rotate scripts through several rounds of rewrites. South Park in its first season was 2 men, a small crew, and a stack of paper. The pilot alone reportedly took around 3 months to finish using the cutout method, which was completely unsustainable, and the production quickly moved toward computer-assisted animation, specifically so the show could keep pace with a broadcast schedule. That shift eventually became one of South Park's defining strengths, since the show could turn around an episode in under a week and respond to real events while they were still happening. The Simpsons, locked into a much longer production cycle, could never do that. But speed came later. In August 1997, South Park was simply a new cable cartoon with terrible-looking animation and a reputation for foul language, arriving in a landscape where one animated show had already planted its flag on nearly every available idea. Critics noticed the crudeness immediately, and plenty of them dismissed it. Newspaper reviews from that first week ranged from cautious curiosity to outright disgust, with at least one calling the premiere sophomoric and unfunny. Papers across the country ran warnings aimed at parents, describing the show as something certain to horrify anyone who stumbled onto it by accident. Coverage focused heavily on the language, the body humor, and the fact that the characters swearing their way through each episode were drawn as third graders. The audience disagreed with the reviews almost immediately. Ratings climbed to levels Comedy Central had never seen from an original series, and the channel found itself sitting on the biggest hit in its history within a matter of weeks. Merchandise followed fast. Shirts, dolls, posters, and catchphrases spread through American high schools at a speed that felt closer to a fad than a television launch, and by the following year, South Park had turned into one of the most talked-about programs on television, regardless of format. Success at that speed brought a specific problem along with it. A cult show that nobody watches gets discussed on its own terms, or not discussed at all. A genuine hit gets measured, and measurement requires a yardstick. Television critics writing about a wildly popular animated comedy in 1998 needed a frame of reference that their readers would instantly understand, and there was really only one candidate available. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That comparison followed Parker and Stone into every interview, every review, and eventually into their own writer's room. What it did to them once it got inside that room ended up producing something no other show on television has ever attempted. Section 2. The comparison that followed them everywhere. Matt Stone has told a version of the same story for close to 30 years now, and the details barely change in the retelling. Shortly after the first episodes went out, a review appeared in a major newspaper, and the two of them sat down to read what a professional critic thought of the thing they had built by hand in a rented office. The verdict, as Stone remembered it, ran roughly like this. There were some funny bits in it, but the show did not deal with the nihilism of suburban life the way Beavis and Butthead did, and it did not handle the complexities of the American family the way The Simpsons did. Stone's reaction to that line has stayed the same across every retelling. He could not believe that anybody was watching Beavis and Butthead and seeing the nihilism of suburban life. Two teenagers laughing at a television set had been turned into a thesis, and their own show had been graded against that thesis and found lacking. The grading itself is the important part. Their brand new cable cartoon had been on television for a matter of weeks, and it was already being measured against 2 established shows rather than described on its own terms. That pattern set in immediately and never really went away. Rolling Stone ran a major profile in early 1998, and coverage across newspapers and magazines throughout that first year followed a familiar shape, positioning South Park somewhere on a line running between Springfield at one end and a couch in Highland at the other. The first full year of coverage made the pattern impossible impossible to miss. Newspapers ran think pieces about what the show's popularity said about American children. School districts banned the shirts. Parent groups issued statements. Editorial writers used the show as evidence of whatever they had already decided was wrong with the culture, and nearly all of them reached for the same historical anchor while doing it, pointing out that people had said similar things about The Simpsons at the start of the decade and asking whether this was simply the next step down the same staircase. Even the defenders used the comparison. Writers arguing that South Park was smarter than it looked tended to make their case by explaining that The Simpsons had also been dismissed as crude garbage in 1990 before being recognized as one of the sharpest programs on television. That defense was generous and probably correct, and it still had the effect of tying the newer show to the older one in the mind of every reader who came across it. Part of that was simply how television criticism worked, and still works. A critic writing about something new reaches for the nearest familiar object and uses it as a ruler. In 1997 and 1998, the ruler for animated comedy was The Simpsons, because there was nothing else with anywhere near the same authority. King of the Hill had launched on Fox in January of 1997, only months before South Park, and it had arrived carrying its own set of Simpsons comparisons for exactly the same reason. Family Guy and Futurama would both launch in 1999 and receive the identical treatment. Every single one of those shows walked into a conversation that had already been shaped by one program, and every single one of them had to spend its early seasons explaining why it was not simply a variation on that program. That is a strange position for any creative team to occupy. The work gets judged against a standard set by somebody else, in a category that somebody else invented, using vocabulary that somebody else established. For Parker and Stone, the comparisons carried an extra sting because of how differently the two shows actually operated. The Simpsons at its peak was a writer's room show in the fullest sense, staffed with people pulled from Harvard, from stand-up, from magazine humor, layering jokes so densely that repeat viewings kept turning up new material in the background. South Park was two men in their late 20s writing almost everything themselves, working fast, prioritizing story momentum over joke density, and treating each season more like a band making an album than a staff assembling a product. Stone has described the process in exactly those terms, comparing a season of South Park to going into the studio and cutting a new record. Two completely different machines, producing two completely different kinds of comedy, permanently filed under the same heading. The comparisons also came from a genuine structural truth that neither man could argue away. Adult animation as a viable primetime business existed because The Simpsons had proven it existed. Networks bought animated comedies in the late 90s because one animated comedy had made an enormous amount of money for Fox. Every pitch meeting in that era carried Springfield in the room whether anybody mentioned it out loud or not, and Stone has confirmed that the pitch meetings for South Park went exactly that way, with executives turning them down because the show did not center on a family. So the influence flowed in two directions at once, and both directions were uncomfortable. The Simpsons had opened the door that allowed South Park to exist, and The Simpsons had simultaneously narrowed the doorway so that anything walking through it looked like it had come from the same house. The comparison also got tangled up in a completely separate argument that had nothing to do with South Park at all. Around the exact moment South Park arrived, a portion of the audience had started saying out loud that The Simpsons was not what it used to be. Season 9, Season 10, Season 11, and the conversation kept growing louder, with longtime viewers pointing at earlier years as the real show and treating everything after as a slow decline. That argument had been building on its own for a while, but the arrival of a genuine new hit gave it a convenient shape. Suddenly, there was a story available to anyone writing about television. The old king was slipping, the new challenger had arrived, and here was a neat little narrative arc that fit comfortably into 800 words. Neither show asked for that framing. Both got stuck with it anyway, and it hardened into a background assumption that colored coverage of both programs for years. The production difference between the two shows kept feeding that narrative as well. The Simpsons worked on a pipeline that could stretch close to a year from first idea to broadcast, with scripts locked far in advance and animation handled overseas. That system produced enormous polish and made genuine topicality almost impossible. South Park, once it moved to computer-assisted animation, could build an entire episode in under a week, which meant it could put something that happened on Monday onto television by Wednesday. Those two clocks produced two different kinds of satire. Springfield satirized things that had settled into place, institutions and habits, and recognizable types. South Park satirized things that were still happening, sometimes before anyone had decided how to feel about them. Comparing the two on the same scale was always going to flatten out the thing that made each one work, and yet the comparisons kept arriving anyway, year after year. There is one more reason the comparison stuck, and it had nothing to do with either show. Cable television in the late 90s was still fighting for legitimacy against the broadcast networks. A hit on Comedy Central was not treated as equivalent to a hit on Fox, no matter what the numbers said, and coverage of cable programming carried a permanent undertone of surprise that anything good could come from there at all. That framing forced South Park into a specific role in almost every article written about it. It was the scrappy cable upstart, defined by what it was not, measured against the network institution across town. Nothing about that role had anything to do with the content of either program. It came from where the shows happened to be broadcast, and from an industry hierarchy that was already starting to collapse. Within a few years, that hierarchy would be gone completely, and cable would produce the most acclaimed television in America. But in 1998, being on Comedy Central meant being explained rather than simply reviewed, and the explanation always started in Springfield. Awards did nothing to break the pattern. South Park spent years being nominated in the same categories as The Simpsons, losing to it repeatedly, and finally winning its first Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program in 2005, beating The Simpsons, Family Guy, Samurai Jack, and SpongeBob SquarePants in the process. Around that same period, the show also collected a Peabody Award, which sits among the most respected honors in American broadcasting and is almost never handed to a cartoon featuring the kind of material South Park specialized in. Stone's reaction to that recognition was mostly bafflement, since the show had spent years being described as a symptom of cultural decline by many of the same institutions now handing it trophies. Winning did not end the comparisons. It simply changed their shape. Instead of being the crude upstart measured against the sophisticated original, South Park became the show that had supposedly taken the crown, which meant every article about it now opened with a paragraph explaining what The Simpsons used to be and where it currently stood. There was one further layer to all of this, and it eventually became the most painful one for Parker and Stone personally. As the years passed and the adult animation field filled out, critics and casual viewers stopped grouping South Park with The Simpsons alone and started grouping it with everything else that was loud, rude, and drawn. Parker and Stone have both said that among the meanest things ever said to them was a compliment, delivered sincerely by people who meant well, telling them that they had one of the best shows on television, right alongside Family Guy. The reason that landed so badly is worth sitting with, because it explains a great deal about what both men actually cared about. They were not offended at being compared to a successful show. They were offended at the assumption that their show and that show were doing the same thing. In their view, South Park episodes were built as stories, with characters making decisions that led to consequences and jokes emerging out of that structure. In their view, the other show was built out of interchangeable interruptions that could be lifted out and dropped into any episode without changing anything. Being praised as two halves of the same product suggested that nobody had noticed the difference. That frustration was not aimed at The Simpsons. Their comments about The Simpsons over the years have been steady and warm. Back in 1997, before anyone knew whether South Park would survive its first season, Matt Stone was already telling interviewers that The Simpsons had all the noise around it, all the merchandise and the hype, but that The Simpsons remained an awesome show and that the popularity flowed from the simple fact that the show itself was great. He described that as the thing he and Parker were actually chasing, and the only thing they cared about at that stage. That comment reads differently with everything that came afterward in mind. In their first year on television, being constantly measured against Springfield, the response from South Park's creators was not resentment, it was agreement. They thought The Simpsons was excellent. They thought its success was earned, and they said so in print, while their own show was still an unproven experiment. It also lines up with how they have described the influence itself. Asked directly whether they felt responsible for opening the doors for the wave of adult animation that followed, Stone pointed backward rather than forward, naming Beavis and Butthead and The Simpsons together as the forerunners to everything they ended up doing. That reads as a settled position rather than a grudging admission dragged out under pressure, repeated calmly across decades by two people who have never shown much interest in being polite about anything else. That respect is what makes what happened later so unusual. Plenty of shows have been accused of copying The Simpsons, and the standard response has been denial, deflection, or counterattack. Parker and Stone took an entirely different route, and they took it because the problem eventually stopped being a media narrative and became a practical obstacle inside their own building. Because a comparison that lives only in newspaper reviews can be ignored. A comparison that follows a writer into the room where the story is being built cannot. And by the year 2000, the phrase that had been chasing South Park through the press had made its way into the writer's room and started killing ideas before they could be written. Once that happened, the joke stopped being a joke. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is a specific episode, produced 2 years before anyone outside that building had heard the phrase, where a plan got thrown out mid-pitch for exactly that reason. What got said in the room that day is the reason the whole thing exists. Section 3. The idea that got killed in the room, December 13th, 2000. South Park is deep into its 4th season, 4 days from Christmas, and the episode going out that night is one of the darkest half hours the show had produced up to that point. It is called The Wacky Molestation Adventure, with Trey Parker handling both the script and the direction, and it opens with something small and completely ordinary. Kyle wants to go to a concert. The band is called the Raging Pussies. Cartman has the tickets, and every other boy in the group is going. Kyle's parents refuse, and then they attach a condition to their refusal that sounds like a joke and turns out to be a cruelty. He can go, they tell him, once he brings democracy to Cuba. Kyle takes the assignment seriously, writes to Fidel Castro, and comes back believing he has earned his ticket. His parents laugh it off. They were never going to let him go. What follows is the part everybody remembers. Cartman explains to Kyle that there is a magic phrase capable of removing parents from a child's life entirely, and coaches him through saying it correctly. Kyle calls the police, accuses his parents of molesting him, and watches them get taken away in the back of a car. He throws a party. He dances around the house in his underwear. Every other kid in town sees how well this has worked and picks up the phone. Within days, South Park has no adults left in it at all. Even Stan's older sister gets hauled away. What remains is a town run entirely by children, and the show follows that idea straight down into the dark, ending up with a settlement split into rival factions, a couple from out of town wandering into the middle of it, and a human sacrifice performed by kids who have invented their own religion in the space of a few weeks. It is worth naming what that episode is actually built out of, because it matters for everything that follows. The children turning feral without adults is Lord of the Flies. The eerie child-run society menacing outsiders is Children of the Corn. The costumes the kids wear are lifted from Mad Max. The ritual sacrifice is a nod to Logan's Run. Trey Parker took 4 recognizable pieces of older popular culture, welded them together, and used the seam lines as part of the joke. Nobody involved treated that as a problem because it was not a problem. Comedy has always worked that way. Reference, remix, escalation, and subversion are the basic tools of the trade, and a show that refused to touch anything anybody had touched before would have nothing left to make jokes about. And yet, somewhere during the building of that same episode, one idea got thrown out of the room specifically because somebody else had used it first. According to the commentary Parker and Stone later recorded for that season, the original plan for the episode included a moment where Cartman blocks out the sun. It fit the character perfectly. Cartman had spent 4 seasons trying to acquire power over the people around him, and darkening the sky over a town full of enemies is precisely the kind of overreach he would attempt. The idea got pitched, and then somebody in the room said the sentence that would eventually become the most famous thing anybody has ever said about The Simpsons. The Simpsons already did it. They had. In May 1995, at the end of the 6th season, Mr. Burns had unveiled a device designed to blot out the sun over Springfield so that the town would be forced to buy more electricity from his power plant. It aired. It became one of the most famous cliffhangers in television history, and by the time a South Park writer opened his mouth in 2000, it had been sitting in the public memory for 5 years, so the idea got cut. The objection had nothing to do with the quality of the idea, how well it fit the story, or any suspicion that Parker was stealing. A different show had gotten there first, and being second felt worse than not doing it at all. The contradiction inside that decision deserves a moment. The same episode kept 4 separate borrowings from older films and books, wore them openly, and treated them as part of the joke. Then it threw out one gag because a cartoon had used a similar image 5 years earlier. Nobody in that room thought lifting the look of Mad Max was a problem. Everybody in that room thought overlapping with Springfield was. The difference comes down to distance. Borrowing from a film released in 1979 reads as reference because the gap in time and medium makes the connection feel deliberate. Landing on the same idea as a cartoon currently airing on a rival network aimed at the same viewers reads as repetition. Same act, completely different reception, decided entirely by proximity. That is a specific kind of creative injury, and it is one that almost nobody outside a writer's room ever thinks about. An idea can die for 100 legitimate reasons. It can be unfunny. It can be off character. It can be too expensive to animate, too slow to set up, too close to something the show did last season. Those are all craft problems, and a room solves craft problems every day without much drama. Getting killed for being second is different because there is no fix. The writer cannot rework it. The room cannot punch it up. The idea is simply contaminated permanently by something that happened somewhere else years earlier, and the only available response is to throw it away and start again. The size of the catalog doing the contaminating turns that injury into something much larger. One show had by that point produced well over 200 episodes across 11 seasons, plus more than 10 Halloween specials carrying 3 separate stories each, all of it aimed at exactly the same target audience through exactly the same medium. By that stage, the catalog had stopped resembling a body of work and started resembling a map with almost no blank territory left on it, which meant that any adult animated comedy operating after 1997 had a problem nobody had ever really faced before. Every idea had to be checked. The pressure came from the audience rather than from lawyers or from anybody at Fox policing the situation, because the viewership itself had turned into the enforcement mechanism. Fans of both shows watched both shows. They noticed overlaps. They said so loudly, and after 1998, they said so on message boards where thousands of other people could read it within hours. That audience behavior is the thing that turned a coincidence into a rule. Writers on any animated comedy knew that if they built a story around something Springfield had touched, a portion of the viewership would spend the entire week talking about the resemblance instead of the episode. The safest move was to check first and avoid it, so the phrase moved from the press into the room. It stopped being a lazy comparison in a newspaper review and became an actual editorial constraint, spoken out loud during pitches, capable of ending a discussion in 4 words. And here is where the situation gets strange, because the constraint kept tightening while the source of it kept growing. The Simpsons did not stop making episodes in 2000. It kept producing more than 20 new stories every year, which meant the forbidden territory expanded by another 20 premises annually, forever, with no endpoint anybody could see. A writer who cleared an idea in one season might find that the same idea aired on Fox 18 months later, purely by coincidence, since both shows were drawing from the same culture at the same time. 2 rooms full of comedy writers, working in the same format, aimed at the same audience, watching the same news, we're always going to land on the same ideas sometimes. That is arithmetic rather than theft. The pressure fell harder on South Park than on almost anybody else because of how the show was made. By the 4th season, the production had settled into a schedule that would have looked insane to any other program on television. An episode could go from a blank whiteboard on Thursday to a finished broadcast the following Wednesday. There was no year of development, no long gap between the writing and the airing, no chance to sit with an idea and see whether it still felt right in 6 months. That speed was the show's greatest weapon and its biggest exposure at the same time. A room moving that fast cannot afford to burn 2 days on a premise and then discover the problem with it. Ideas have to be judged almost instantly, and anything carrying a complication gets dropped rather than solved. Under those conditions, 4 words spoken by a colleague at the wrong moment can end a story permanently, and there is no time to argue about whether the objection was fair. The audience side of the problem had grown just as fast. Those were the first years in which television fandom lived in public, on forums and news groups and early fan sites, where episodes were dissected within hours of airing. Both shows had enormous overlapping followings in those spaces. Both had fans who could recite episode titles from memory and who treated cataloging references as part of the fun. That culture made comparison unavoidable. A South Park episode touching anything Springfield had touched would be flagged before the credits finished rolling, and the discussion discussion would spread outward from there for days. Nobody had to be malicious about it. Fans were simply doing what fans do, spotting connections and pointing them out to each other, and the cumulative effect was a permanent low-level audit of every idea the show put on screen. South Park was not alone in living under that audit. Futurama, launched in 1999 by people who had actually worked on The Simpsons, spent its entire run being compared to the show its creator had built. Family Guy, launched the same year, took the accusation far harder and far more directly, and would spend the following decade absorbing jokes from Springfield aimed squarely at the resemblance between the two programs. Everybody in the field was operating in the shadow of the same catalog. What separated Parker from the rest was that he stopped treating the shadow as an insult and started treating it as a fact worth examining out loud. Something else about that period made the pressure worse. The catalog was large, and it was also permanently on television. Reruns of The Simpsons ran in syndication several times a day in most American markets, which meant a viewer could watch 4 episodes from 4 different seasons before dinner. The show was never in the past tense for anybody. It stayed permanently available, permanently in circulation, and permanently fresh in the memory of exactly the audience South Park was trying to surprise. A writer competing against something that no longer airs has time on his side, since the reference fades. A writer competing against something running in a loop on 3 channels does not. Whatever Springfield had done in 1993 was still on somebody's screen that afternoon. The frustration built through the following seasons, and it arrived at a moment when South Park was already in the middle of examining its own machinery. Season 5 had killed Kenny for real and retired the running gag that had defined the show's public image since its first year. Season 6 opened with the boys visibly trying to fill that hole, cycling through replacement characters, holding an on-screen contest to find a new 4th friend, and generally treating the show's own formula as something that could be taken apart and inspected in front of the audience. That was an unusual thing for a hit show to put on screen. A program feeling settled about its own habits does not spend a season premiere holding auditions to replace a joke it just retired. That was the mood in the building. A show that had spent 5 years being described as the crude new thing was now old enough to have habits, running gags, expectations, and a formula that its own creators had started poking at. A show in that condition, carrying 5 years of accumulated irritation about being told that somebody else had already done everything, is a show that is going to do something about it eventually. Most creative teams would have handled it privately, complain in the room, cut the idea, move on, and never let the audience see the seam. Parker went the other way completely. He took the exact sentence that had been killing his ideas, put it on the screen, built an entire episode around it, and handed the argument to a character who could not win it. The result aired in June 2002, and it remains one of the few times in television history that a show has publicly conceded an argument about its own originality. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The character chosen to carry that concession had been introduced only weeks earlier as a joke about how badly South Park needed a replacement for somebody it had already killed. What Parker put him through over the following 22 minutes goes further than any show has gone before or since. Section 4, Professor Chaos and the 22-minute confession. The episode aired on Comedy Central on June 26, 2002. It was the 7th episode of Season 6 and the 86th episode of the series overall. Trey Parker wrote it and directed it, which by that stage of the show meant it carried his intentions almost undiluted. The title was The Simpsons Already Did It. It picks up directly from the previous episode, which had aired 11 weeks earlier on April 10th and which had ended with Butters Stotch adopting the identity of Professor Chaos. Butters had spent that episode being rejected, tested, and finally discarded by the group of boys who had briefly adopted him, and he had responded by wrapping himself in a cape made of tinfoil, appointing a single loyal assistant, and announcing that he would bring disorder to the entire town. That earlier episode had been built as a parody of The Bachelor, which was a new show at the time, and which had turned the process of eliminating people one by one into primetime entertainment. South Park took that format and applied it to friendship. The boys needed somebody to fill an empty spot in the group, so they held auditions, brought in candidates, and dismissed them in rounds while the losers reacted on camera. Butters, who had been filling that spot temporarily, was cut. Tweak got the job. Being fired from a friendship is a strange humiliation to build a supervillain out of, and that is exactly why it works. Butters does not turn to evil because of injustice or tragedy or a lost family. He turns to evil because a group of 9-year-olds ran a selection process and picked somebody else. The scale of the wound and the scale of the response are wildly mismatched, which is the engine of nearly every every joke the character produces from that point forward. His assistant was a boy named Dougie, operating under the name General Disarray. Dougie's role in the partnership is to stand slightly behind Butters, hold things, and offer opinions. He is the only person on Earth who takes Professor Chaos seriously, which makes what he does over the following 22 minutes considerably more painful. The first plan is the big one. Butters announces that he will block out the sun over South Park, plunging the town into permanent darkness and forcing everybody to live under his shadow. It is a proper supervillain scheme, delivered with real conviction, and it lasts about 4 seconds before Dougie points out that Mr. Burns did this on The Simpsons. Butters abandons it immediately, not reluctantly, and not after an argument. The moment the objection lands, the plan is dead, exactly the way an idea dies in a real writer's room when somebody raises the same objection about the same show. The second plan is smaller and angrier. If he cannot own the sky, he will strike at the town's dignity instead. Butters climbs the statue in the middle of South Park and cuts the head off it, an act of pure vandalism aimed at the thing the town supposedly holds sacred. The response to that act is where the episode reveals what it is actually about. The local news covers the beheading, and the reporter does not describe it as a crime or a threat or an act of hatred. The reporter describes it as an homage to The Simpsons, because Bart Simpson had beheaded the statue of the town founder in an early episode. Then comes the detail that turns the joke into something with real teeth. The police announce they will not be investigating, because they would prefer to leave the statue headless as a tribute to the show. Butters has not simply been beaten to an idea, he has been absorbed. His act of rebellion has been reclassified by the culture around him as a fan gesture, a friendly nod, a piece of appreciation aimed at the very thing standing in his way. The town has taken his crime and turned it into merchandise. Choosing Butters to carry all of this was not an accident either. Any other character on the show would have wrecked the joke. Cartman would have refused to accept the objection and simply done it anyway, loudly, because Cartman has never cared what anybody else has done first. Kyle would have argued the point on principle and turned the episode into a debate. Stan would have shrugged and moved on within a minute. Butters is the only one who takes the criticism completely to heart. He is the character built entirely out of a desire to do things properly and be approved of for it, which makes him the perfect vessel for a fear about originality. He does not want to break rules. He wants to be told he did something right. Telling a person like that his idea belongs to somebody else does more damage than any insult could. The third plan escalates the ambition again. Butters decides to con the entire town into building a monorail it does not need, a scheme with real scale to it, requiring persuasion and showmanship, and a public that can be talked into anything. Dougie kills it in one line. The Simpsons already did it. By this point, the pattern has locked in, and Parker starts running the machine at speed. Every idea Butters raises comes back flagged. The failures stack on top of each other, and the character's confidence starts visibly draining out of him, replaced by something closer to panic. The rhythm of that middle stretch is what makes the episode land rather than simply repeat itself. Parker builds it like a music routine. First attempt gets a full setup, a proper reveal, and a beat of silence before the objection arrives. Second attempt gets less room. By the fourth and fifth attempts, Butters barely finishes the sentence before Dougie is already shaking his head, and the audience is arriving at the punchline before the characters do. There is even a stretch where the episode leans on a piece of music built entirely around the idea of untouchable territory, using a hit song from the early 90s whose entire hook is a warning that nobody else can have this. Dropping that behind a montage about a child failing to find one unclaimed idea is the kind of layered joke the show rarely gets credit for, because the surface is always loud enough to hide the construction underneath. So Butters does the only rational thing available. He decides to solve the problem through research. If the obstacle is a catalog, he will learn the catalog. He sits down and watches the show all the way through, taking notes, building a map of occupied territory so that he can finally find one patch of ground nobody has stood on. The joke buried in that sequence is one of the best in the episode, and most viewers miss it entirely. Butters reports back that he has watched every single episode, and the number he gives is 132. At the time this episode aired, The Simpsons had broadcast close to 300. Butters has not watched the show. Butters has watched under half the show, believes he has finished, and is about to make a decision based on a map with enormous blank sections he does not know exist. There is a second joke folded into that number, and it is aimed at the audience rather than the character. Anybody watching in 2002 who tried to do what Butters did would have discovered the same thing he did, which is that the catalog is simply too large to hold in one head. Fans who had watched the show every week since childhood still could not have listed every plot from every season. The thing everybody was afraid of colliding with was not something anybody had actually surveyed. Butters is not being stupid when he stops at 132. He is doing what every writer in that position does, which is check as much as he can stand and then hope for the best. Armed with his incomplete research, he finds a gap and builds a plan inside it. An original idea, verified, cleared, unique. He is ready. That same night, The Simpsons airs a brand new episode featuring exactly that plot. This is the moment the character breaks, and it is worth being precise about why. Everything up to this point had been a problem of history. Somebody got there first, years ago, and Butters was simply late. Losing to a new episode is a different injury entirely, because it proves the territory is still expanding faster than anyone can survey it. There is no amount of work that can protect him. The show will always be somewhere ahead, generating new claims faster than he can research old ones. What follows is the strangest sequence in the episode. Butters loses his grip on reality, and his hallucination takes a particular form. The world around him shifts into the Simpsons art style. Yellow skin, overbites, four fingers. Everyone he looks at, everywhere he goes, rendered in the visual language of the thing that has been defeating him. That image works on more than one level. On the surface, it is a broad joke, an art shift played for laughs, letting the animators build a South Park episode that briefly looks like a different show. Underneath it is a precise description of what obsession does to a person. Butters has spent so long checking his ideas against one catalog that the catalog has replaced his eyesight. He cannot see anything except through it anymore. Anyone who has ever tried to make something inside a crowded field recognizes that condition immediately. The reference that was supposed to be a tool becomes the only lens available. Every new thought gets processed through it before it is even finished forming. The comparison stops being something that happens to the work and becomes the thing the work is made of. Running alongside all of this is the episode's second story, which looks completely unrelated for most of the running time. Cartman sees an advertisement for a product called Sea People, which is the show's version of the mail-order brine shrimp that were sold to American children for decades under a far more exciting name. The advertisement promises a civilization of intelligent underwater beings. Cartman convinces the other boys to pool their money, sings a song about leaving the planet to go live among them, and wakes up the next morning fully expecting a new life. What arrives is a packet of shrimp, tiny, silent, unimpressive, and entirely uninterested in taking anybody anywhere. Disappointed, the boys use the creatures in a prank on their teacher. The prank goes wrong in a way nobody intended, and their teacher dies. Convinced they are responsible, the boys panic and take increasingly desperate steps to cover their involvement, which leads to Cartman combining the shrimp with a biological ingredient he obtains through means the show plays entirely for shock value. The result is that the shrimp evolve rapidly. They build cities, develop technology, form societies, and begin worshipping Cartman as a god, staring up at the enormous face pressed against the glass of their tank. That plot is the setup for the entire ending of the episode, and it is also, deliberately, another borrowed idea. Everything in it had been done before, by more than one show, including the exact show Butters has spent the episode losing to, which is the point. Parker spends 22 minutes destroying a character over the impossibility of originality, and then spends the last few minutes explaining why the whole panic was a mistake in the first place. Critics who went back to the episode years later tended to single out the same quality in it. Writing for IGN, Travis Pickett gave it a high score and praised the way Parker and Stone had managed to pay their respects to another show while filling the same half hour with material that show could never have aired in 1,000 years. Both things are true at once. The episode is an act of genuine deference toward The Simpsons, and it is simultaneously 22 minutes of content built specifically to demonstrate the distance between the two programs. That balance is the whole trick. A straight tribute would have been boring. A straight attack would have been petty and would have contradicted everything Parker and Stone had said publicly about the show for years. What they made instead is a piece of television that says two things at the same time without either one canceling the other out. The Simpsons got here first, and got here first on almost everything, and that is a real and permanent fact about the world. And also, the ground South Park is standing on is not the same ground, no matter how similar the map looks from a distance. The placement in the season adds one more layer worth noticing. starting. Season 6 of South Park had started in March, run through a handful of episodes, and then paused. This episode came back after that gap, restarting the season, which meant it functioned as a return rather than a routine week. A show coming back from a break generally leads with something it wants people to talk about. What South Park chose to lead with was an admission of debt. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Every plan Dougie shot down pointed at a real Simpsons episode, and the 3 he named are among the most celebrated half hours the show ever produced. Lining them up against what Butters was attempting shows exactly how carefully Parker chose them. Section 5. The 3 episodes on Dougie's list. The first of the 3 arrived earlier than almost anybody would guess, and the date attached to it is startling. The Telltale Head aired on February 25, 1990. That is the 8th episode of The Simpsons ever broadcast. The show had been on the air for roughly 2 months. It had not yet found its voice, the animation was still wobbly, the characters were still drifting between designs, and Homer's personality had not settled into anything close to what it would become. The story is simple. Bart wants to impress a trio of older bullies named Jimbo, Dolph, and Kearney, who hang around the town looking for trouble and who casually mention how funny it would be if somebody cut the head off the statue of Jebediah Springfield in the middle of town. Bart, desperate for approval, goes out at night with a saw and does it. What follows is not a celebration. The bullies are horrified. They had been talking, not planning, and the moment somebody actually does the thing they had joked about, they want to find whoever did it and hurt him. The town goes into genuine mourning. People weep in the street. Even Mr. Burns, the least sentimental man in Springfield, is shown crying at the sight of the ruined statue. Bart, carrying the head around in a sack, starts hearing it talk to him. He cannot sleep. He cannot eat. The episode is framed as a confession told to an angry mob that has cornered him and his father, and the whole structure is lifted openly from a famous Edgar Allan Poe story about a murderer driven mad by the sound of a heart beating under the floorboards. The title says so directly. That episode also happened to be the first appearance of a remarkable number of characters who would define the show for decades, including Sideshow Bob, Reverend Lovejoy, Apu, and the bullies themselves. It is a foundational piece of the series, produced before anybody knew there would be a series to build on. What makes it strange to revisit now is how heavy it is. This is a show most people remember for jokes, and one of its earliest episodes is a slow study of guilt in a child, with a genuine mob at the end of it, and a father who realizes his own advice caused the whole thing. Homer had told Bart that being popular was the most important thing in the world. Bart took him at his word. The episode makes both of them sit in the consequences of that. The bullies get one of the sharpest beats in it. When they hear what happened, they turn furious, and their explanation for why they are not responsible is that talking about doing something is not the same as doing it. They were only running their mouths. Bart was the one who brought a saw, and that is the first thing Butters runs into. Not an obscure episode from a forgotten season. The 8th episode ever made, from a show that had barely started, already occupying the exact patch of ground he chose for his own act of rebellion. The second episode on the list is one that people frequently name as the best thing the show ever produced. Marge vs. the Monorail aired on January 14, 1993, in the middle of the 4th season. It was written by Conan O'Brien, who was working as a Simpsons writer at the time and who would leave for late-night television later that same year. It was directed by Rich Moore, the same director who had handled The Telltale Head 3 years earlier. The setup is pure Springfield logic. Mr. Burns is caught dumping nuclear waste and gets hit with an enormous fine, which arrives in the town's hands as an unexpected windfall. A public meeting is called to decide what to do with the money. Marge argues sensibly for repairing Main Street, which is falling apart, and then a stranger walks in. His name is Lyle Lanley, voiced by Phil Hartman in what many people consider the finest guest performance in the show's history. Lanley does not argue with anybody. He does not present figures or studies. He sings. He gets the entire population of the town singing along with him inside of 2 minutes, and by the end of the song, Springfield has voted to spend every cent on a monorail nobody needs, built by a man nobody checked on. The song itself was written by O'Brien together with Al Jean, who was running the show at the time, and it has outlived most of the episodes around it. People who have never seen the episode know the chant. It functions in the story the way a con man's patter always functions, moving too fast for anybody to ask a question, building agreement out of rhythm rather than argument, and ending with a room full of people who have committed to something they cannot explain. The monorail is garbage. The train is unsafe. The driver is Homer, and the whole thing nearly kills half the town before Marge tracks Lanley down and works out that he has done the same con in several other cities. Leonard Nimoy shows up as himself and contributes almost nothing, which is part of the joke. The episode is a strange choice for the most beloved half hour of a family sitcom, because the family barely holds it together. Marge is the only one behaving sensibly, and the story is really about a town rather than a household. That looseness is exactly what fans point to when they explain why they love it. The show had reached a level of confidence where it could abandon its own format for 22 minutes and trust the audience to follow. That episode is also built on borrowed bones, and openly so. The traveling salesman who arrives in a small town, wins everybody over with a musical number, sells them something useless, and skips town with the money is the entire plot of The Music Man, a stage musical that had been famous in America since the late 1950s. Conan O'Brien took a structure everybody already knew and dropped it into Springfield. So Butters, reaching for a scheme with real scale to it, lands on the plot of an episode that is regularly voted the greatest in the show's history, and which was itself an adaptation of something older. The third episode is the biggest of them all. Who Shot Mr. Burns aired its first half on May 21, 1995, as the closing episode of Season 6, written by Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein. The plot that matters here is the one Butters reaches for first. Mr. Burns decides to increase his profits by building an enormous device that blocks the sun over Springfield, forcing the entire town to pay him for artificial light around the clock. The image is unforgettable. An old man in a control room, cackling, turning a wheel that slides a metal disc across the sky and drops a whole town into darkness. It is the purest expression of the character the show ever produced, and it sits inside the most famous cliffhanger in the show's history, the one that left the country arguing about a shooting for an entire summer. The sun-blocking machine was only one piece of a much larger scheme inside that episode, and the surrounding damage is what gave it weight. Springfield Elementary strikes oil under the playground, which promises to rescue a school that had been falling apart for years. Burns wants that oil, and his slant drilling operation takes it while wrecking a substantial portion of the town in the process, damaging the retirement home, Moe's Tavern, and the Simpson family's own circumstances along the way. By the time he stands up in front of the town to gloat about the sun, half of Springfield has a personal reason to want him dead. Then he gets shot, the screen cuts to black, and the show leaves the country hanging until the following September. The second half aired on September 17, 1995, revealing that the shooter had been Maggie, which almost nobody had guessed. That gap between the two halves turned into a genuine national guessing game, complete with a contest, a website, and months of speculation, which means that when Butters announces he is going to blot out the sun, he is repeating the single most famous villainous act in the entire catalog, from an episode that a large portion of the audience watched live and then talked about for months. Lined up together, the three of them reveal an obvious design. The telltale head is petty vandalism carried out by a child seeking approval. Marge versus the monorail is a confidence trick played on a gullible public. Who Shot Mr. Burns is a supervillain scheme aimed at an entire population, small, medium, large. A ladder of ambition running from a boy with a saw to an old man with a machine. Butters climbs that exact ladder in the opposite direction, starting at the top with the sun, falling back to the statue, then reaching for the monorail and getting stopped at every rung. Parker picked 3 episodes that map perfectly onto the range of things a villain in a small American town could plausibly attempt, which is another way of saying he picked 3 episodes that between them cover the entire available field. The choice also reveals something about how the joke was expected to travel. These 3 episodes are the ones a general audience could be counted on to recognize without any explanation at all. A viewer in 2002 did not need to be told which episode featured a man blocking out the sun, or which one featured a monorail, or which one featured a statue losing its head. Those images had escaped the show entirely and become part of the shared furniture of American television. That is the real reason the joke works on people who have never watched a full Simpsons episode in their lives. The catalog Butters keeps colliding with is common property rather than a private library. Everybody knows the monorail. Everybody knows the sun. The episode is not asking the audience to be a specialist. It is pointing at the things the audience already carries around without noticing. A cruelty runs through the selection that is easy to miss. None of these are weak episodes. None of them are obscure. All three are episodes that fans rank among the show's best work. From the years everybody agrees were the peak, Butters is losing to the strongest material his opponent ever produced. And the years those episodes come from tell their own story. 1990, 1993, 1995. All of them broadcast before South Park existed as a television show. Two of them broadcast before Parker and Stone had even made the short film that got them noticed. The territory was claimed before the competition arrived, which is why the argument was never winnable in the first place. The choice of that particular window, rather than anything more recent, was deliberate. By 2002, The Simpsons had produced 6 or 7 additional seasons beyond Who Shot Mr. Burns, containing hundreds of further premises he could have used. The reason is partly that the older episodes were more famous, and partly something less flattering. The years everybody points to as the show's peak are the years those 3 episodes come from, and Parker was making a joke about being unable to compete with the best version of something. Using a plot from a recent season would have introduced an argument nobody wanted, since a portion of the audience would have started debating whether those seasons counted. Choosing 1990, 1993, and 1995 removed that problem entirely. Nobody was going to argue that those episodes were weak. The joke needed an opponent who could not be dismissed, and Parker selected one accordingly. One more detail deserves attention here, because it becomes the key to everything in the following section. Every single one of those 3 episodes was itself built on top of something older. The Telltale Head takes its title, its structure, and its central image of guilt from a short story published in 1843. Marge vs. the Monorail takes its plot from a musical that had been running in American theaters for decades. And Who Shot Mr. Burns took its entire cliffhanger structure, the shooting, the summer of speculation, the list of suspects, directly from a famous primetime drama that had pulled the same trick 15 years earlier and drawn one of the largest television audiences ever recorded. 3 episodes, 3 borrowings, all of them acknowledged, all of them obvious to anybody paying attention, none of them ever presented by the show as original inventions. The catalog that Butters cannot get past is a wall built out of other people's bricks, stacked higher and faster than anybody else managed, by a show that never once claimed the bricks were its own. That is the wall Butters kept walking into. 3 episodes, spread across 5 years, every one of them assembled out of material somebody else had made first, and every one of them treated by the culture around him as ground nobody else was allowed to stand on. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The cure for Butters does not come from a therapist, a friend, or a moment of self-acceptance. It comes from 4 children who do not care about his problem at all, and from one detail about a fish tank that takes the whole argument apart in about 10 seconds. Section 6. The Fish Tank Argument. By the final act, Butters has nothing left. He is walking around a town rendered in somebody else's animation style. His schemes are gone, his research was worthless, and the only thing he has left is the accusation itself. So he uses it on somebody else. He finds the boys standing around Cartman's aquarium, watching the tiny civilization they have accidentally created, and he tells them the truth as he now understands it. This is not original. The Simpsons already did it. He is right, and he can point to the exact episode. In October 1996, the 7th annual Halloween special included a segment in which Lisa places a tooth in a cup of cola for a science project, gets zapped with static electricity by Bart, and accidentally creates life. Within days, the creatures inside the cup have evolved from primitive tools to advanced technology, and they have begun worshipping Lisa as a god while treating Bart as a devil. Eventually, they shrink her down and pull her inside, where she discovers they have no way of sending her back. That is the same idea. A child, a container, a miniature society, and worship. Butters has finally caught somebody in the act, and he says so. The response he gets is the reason this episode is remembered. The boys do not argue. They do not deny it. They do not care. Their position, delivered with complete indifference, is that the show has done everything at this point, and that it also does things other shows did first, so the whole objection is meaningless. And then Chef delivers the piece of information that ends the argument permanently, pointing out that the plot in question was itself taken from an episode of The Twilight Zone. He is right too. The Halloween segment was an acknowledged parody of a 1962 Twilight Zone episode called The Little People, in which astronauts land on a planet and discover a civilization of tiny beings, and one of them decides to act as their god. The Simpsons version changed the ending and softened the character at the center of it, but the source was never hidden. The writers have discussed it openly. Anybody who had seen the original recognized it instantly. The details on both sides of that chain are worth laying out because they make the point better than any argument could. The Simpsons segment was called The Genesis Tub, and it opened the 8th season on October 27, 1996. It was pitched by David S. Cohen, one of the writers who would later go on to help build Futurama. Technically, it was a small landmark for the show since the sequence in which a fleet of tiny spacecraft attacks Bart was one of the first times the production used computers to build models for the animators to work from. It also contains one of the most quoted invented words in the show's history when Lisa realizes the tiny people possess a machine capable of shrinking her, but nothing capable of reversing the process. The Twilight Zone episode behind it aired in 1962 in the show's 3rd season. Astronauts crash on a planet and discover a civilization of miniature people living among the rocks. One of the two men decides that being enormous makes him a god, forces the tiny people to build statues in his honor, and rules them through fear. The story ends by scaling the joke up one more level when a pair of far larger visitors arrive, pick him up out of curiosity, and crush him without noticing. The Simpsons kept the structure and changed the temperature. Lisa is a kind god rather than a cruel one. The ending traps her instead of killing her, and the whole thing runs at comic speed rather than as a slow moral fable. That is the actual work. The method is to take a known shape, change who stands at the center of it, change what it is trying to say, and let the audience enjoy recognizing the original while watching it get twisted. So the chain runs backward. Butters copies The Simpsons. The Simpsons copied The Twilight Zone, and The Twilight Zone was itself an anthology series that spent 5 seasons adapting science fiction stories and folktales that had been circulating for decades before it existed. Hearing that, Butters is cured, instantly and completely. The obsession that had destroyed him over the previous 20 minutes evaporates the moment somebody points out that the thing he was worshipping as untouchable was standing on somebody else's shoulders the entire time. The episode then delivers its actual ending, and it is bleak in a way that has nothing to do with the main argument. The tiny civilization inside the tank splits into 2 religious factions, one loyal to Cartman and one loyal to Tweak, and the 2 sides annihilate each other in a nuclear war. Cartman, watching the smoke rise off the water, wonders aloud why societies cannot simply live in peace. The show gives him no answer and cuts away. Set against everything preceding it, that ending makes the shape of the whole episode clear. Butters spends the episode paralyzed by the fear of repeating something. The tiny people spend a few days repeating the single oldest mistake in human history at high speed. The episode's position on originality is not subtle. Nothing is new. Everything has happened. The species itself is a rerun. That argument, held up against The Simpsons, is where the whole thing lands. The Simpsons never claimed to be original. Not once. Not in any interview. Not in the show itself. Its entire method was open, deliberate, unembarrassed borrowing. The Halloween specials that produced the Tooth Civilization were built almost entirely out of other people's work. They adapted Twilight Zone episodes repeatedly, year after year. They adapted horror films, science fiction films, short stories, poems, and novels. The whole annual tradition was a parody engine, running on material the audience already knew. The list of sources inside that tradition reads like a syllabus: a Stephen King novel about a caretaker losing his mind in an empty hotel, a Twilight Zone story about a girl who falls through a hole in her bedroom wall into another dimension, which the show rebuilt as a computer-animated sequence with Homer inside it. Another Twilight Zone story about aliens arriving with a book whose title changes meaning depending on how much of it has been uncovered. A Poe poem read aloud, almost word for word, by a famous actor, with the show's characters standing in for the figures inside it. The Simpsons did not disguise any of that. In several cases, the title of the segment gave the source away before the story started. The audience was expected to recognize the material, and the pleasure was built around the recognition rather than damaged by it. The same thing was true outside the Halloween specials. The show's most famous running feature, the cartoon within the cartoon that Bart watches obsessively, exists specifically as an exaggerated version of the violent cat and mouse shorts that had been on American television since the 1940s. Whole episodes were structured as retellings of films, plays, and novels. Guest stars were used to parody their own careers. The show's writers came from a comedy tradition where recognizing the source was half the pleasure. None of that was hidden, and none of it was a weakness. The Simpsons was never competing on the question of whether an idea had existed before. It was competing on what it did with the idea once it had it. Specificity, execution, character, timing, the particular detail that turns a familiar shape into something that feels like it belongs to Springfield and nowhere else, which means the fear that had been strangling South Park's writer's room was aimed at a standard the show they were afraid of had never once tried to meet. That is the sense in which Springfield had the question settled years before Colorado started worrying about it, and it is a larger and stranger thing to be right about than simply getting somewhere first. The Simpsons demonstrated across hundreds of episodes and more than a decade that originality of premise is not what makes comedy work. It proved that by consuming everything in sight openly and producing the most influential animated series in television history out of the results, South Park spent 5 years treating that catalog as a fence. The episode that finally dealt with the problem concluded that the fence was never there, and that the show, which supposedly built it, had spent its entire existence walking through fences of its own. There is a wider tradition sitting underneath all of this that neither show invented. Comedy in America had been built on reuse for a century before either of them existed. Vaudeville performers passed routines around until nobody could say who wrote them. Radio comedy recycled structures from the stage. The situation comedy itself is a fixed template that has been refilled with new characters every few years since the 1950s, and nobody watching a sitcom has ever been troubled by the fact that a family arguing in a living room is not a new idea. Animation carried the habit even further, because animation is expensive and studios reuse anything that works. Chase cartoons, talking animals, hapless fathers, clever children. Those were established shapes long before Springfield existed, and The Simpsons took every one of them and pushed harder than anybody had pushed before. Seen against that history, the panic inside South Park's writer's room looks less like a reasonable creative standard and more like a symptom of the era. That period was the first in which a large audience could compare two shows in public, instantly, in enormous numbers. The anxiety was new. The behavior it was policing was as old as the medium. The speed of the cure is doing something as well. The show could have given him a long journey toward acceptance. Instead, a single fact from a person who is not even part of the conversation resolves the entire crisis in one line. That is a comment on the crisis itself. It had never been a real problem, only a story somebody had told him, and the moment somebody told him a different story, he was fine. Parker did not reach this conclusion quietly and move on. He put it on television, gave the argument to a group of children who deliver it with total indifference, and let a cook, standing off to the side, supply the historical evidence. The scene lasts under a minute. It is not scored for importance, nobody makes a speech, and the show cuts away from it almost immediately. That casualness is the point. A show making a grand statement about creative influence would have staged it. South Park treated it as obvious, because by that stage in the writing of the episode, it had become obvious, and the only character who still cared was the one everybody agreed had lost his mind. It also helps to consider what the alternative would have looked like. A show fully committed to never touching an occupied premise would have run out of material inside 2 seasons. Family stories, school stories, religion, money, illness, death, politics, holidays, competition, jealousy. Every one of those was claimed decades before either program existed, most of them by radio comedies, many of them by stage plays. The only escape from that constraint is to accept it and compete somewhere else, which is what every working comedy writer eventually learns, and what almost nobody says out loud in an interview. Parker said it out loud, in a cartoon, using a boy in a tinfoil cape. That is why the episode has outlived nearly everything around it in that season. Its survival has little to do with the jokes being the best the show ever wrote. It survives because it is the clearest statement anybody in television ever made about a problem that every creative person runs into and almost nobody resolves. The effect on the show afterward is measurable for anybody watching closely. From that point forward, South Park stopped behaving like a program worried about overlap. It took on subjects other shows had covered, repeatedly and without hesitation, and competed on angle and speed instead. It built entire seasons around continuing storylines. It went after targets that were being covered by every late-night program in America and got there faster and dirtier. The anxiety about being second simply stopped being a factor in what the show would attempt. Whether that shift came directly from making this episode is impossible to prove. What is certain is that the show never made another episode about the problem, and the phrase that had been ending pitches inside that building went out into the world instead and became a joke that everybody else had to live with. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, this, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Springfield had been watching all of this, and Springfield had opinions. What came back the following spring was a scene most Simpsons fans consider one of the worst things the show produced that year, aimed directly at the people who had just paid it the biggest compliment in television. Section 7. Springfield Answers Back, May 18, 2003. The Simpsons is closing out its 14th season with an episode called The Bard of War, written by Mark Wilmore and directed by Mike Frank Polcino, the 312th episode of the series. It opens on Bart and Milhouse sitting in front of a television, watching what the show announces as a brand new episode of South Park. The animation on screen is a blend of the two styles. Stan, Kyle, and Cartman appear as flattened cutout figures, but rendered with Springfield's colors and line work rather than their own. Kenny is missing entirely, which tracked with reality at the time, since South Park had killed the character off for real 2 years earlier and had not yet brought him back permanently. What happens in that fake episode is the interesting part. The boys are performing at a concert. O.J. Simpson appears, attacks the performers, and kills them. Cartman is decapitated. O.J. announces that he is going to go find the real killer. Bart and Milhouse, watching, exchange observations about cartoon violence and about the strangeness of adults providing the voices for animated children. Then Marge walks in, sees what is on the screen, and shuts it off. Her stated reason is that the show is not life-affirming. She replaces it with a religious program about angels airing on a small family-friendly network, and the boys, bored out of their minds, wander outside, which sets the actual plot of the episode in motion. That plot involves Ned Flanders, a basement full of Beatles memorabilia, 2 rival youth organizations, and a full-scale brawl at a minor league baseball stadium. None of it has anything to do with South Park. The parody is a cold open, over in a couple of minutes, and then the episode goes somewhere else entirely. The chain of events in between is worth following, because it explains why the South Park scene is there at all. With nothing to watch, the boys go outside. They end up tying a thread to a fly, the fly goes through a window into the Flanders house, and the boys follow it inside. Left alone in an empty home, they wreck the place, and the damage includes Ned's carefully preserved Beatles collection, which the show mines for a run of drink and food puns built out of the band members' names. Marge decides Bart needs structure, enrolls him in a youth group, and the episode spends its remaining 20 minutes escalating a rivalry between 2 clubs of children until an entire baseball stadium is brawling. So the South Park scene serves one narrative function. It gets the boys off the couch. Everything that follows depends on Marge switching off the television, and the show needed something on that television offensive enough to justify her doing it. The choice of South Park was convenient rather than considered, which is exactly how the finished scene plays. Reviews at the time were harsh across the board, and later retrospectives have been harsher. The Bard of War turns up regularly on lists of the weakest episodes of that era, with fan writers singling out the ending in particular, where the show reaches for emotion it has not earned and lands on a line of dialogue that gets quoted as an example of how far the writing had drifted. The South Park scene specifically drew criticism from people who otherwise had no strong feelings about either show. The core problem was that the parody did not appear to be aimed at anything in particular. South Park's episode had been surgical. It named 3 specific Simpsons episodes, described their plots accurately, and used real details from real broadcasts. Springfield's reply parodied nothing that had ever actually aired. There is no South Park episode featuring the boys in a band being murdered by O.J. Simpson. There is no episode built around that premise at all. What the scene parodied was an impression of South Park rather than the show itself. Fart humor, violence, celebrity cameos. Those are the 3 things a person who had never watched an episode would list if asked to describe it, and the scene assembled them into a sketch. The celebrity choices made it worse. O.J. Simpson had been a national obsession in the mid-90s, and by 2003, he was old news. The scene also worked in a reference to an actress whose peak fame had passed years earlier. A show being mocked for chasing cheap topical material got answered with a joke built out of topical material that had gone stale half a decade before. That gap between the 2 responses says a great deal about how each show was operating by that point. Parker had watched The Simpsons closely enough to name episodes from 1990, 1993, and 1995 and get every plot detail correct. Whoever wrote the Springfield scene appeared to be working from a general impression of what people said about South Park rather than from the show itself. One side did homework, the other side did not, and the result landed with an audience that noticed immediately. Marge's line is the part of the scene that actually works, and it works for reasons that have almost nothing to do with South Park at all. Objecting that a program is not life-affirming is a perfect perfect Marge sentiment, and it also functions as a statement of values from the show delivering it. The Simpsons, whatever else it did in any given week, almost always ended with the family intact and something warm underneath the cruelty. South Park frequently did not. Marge reaching for the remote is Springfield, drawing a line around its own identity, and it is the only moment in the scene that comes from a position rather than a stereotype. The observation about adults voicing children is a sharper jab than it first appears, and it also cuts in both directions. Bart Simpson has been voiced by an adult woman since 1987. Lisa, Milhouse, Nelson, Ralph, and Todd Flanders are all voiced by adults. Putting that criticism into Bart's mouth means the joke either failed to notice its own position or noticed it perfectly and enjoyed the irony. Given the era, either reading is plausible. What is not in doubt is that the scene existed specifically because of what South Park had done the year before. The connection was noted immediately by viewers, has been documented ever since, and makes the timing impossible to read any other way. South Park spent an entire episode conceding that The Simpsons got there first. The Simpsons waited 11 months and answered with a 2-minute sketch about a cartoon it did not appear to have watched. That was not the first time Springfield had reached for a South Park joke either. A season 12 episode called Worst Episode Ever, built around a comic book store and the machinery of fandom, had at one stage included a line where Bart tells Milhouse to mark down the South Park merchandise. It did not make the finished broadcast. The final version swapped it for a line about clearing out Poochie stock instead, which was a joke aimed at the show's own history rather than somebody else's. Traces of the original line survived in the closed captioning, which is how anybody knows it existed at all. That buried line is a small thing, but it points at something real about the period. Around the turn of the century, Springfield's writers were clearly aware of South Park's merchandising explosion and found it worth a joke. Worst Episode Ever was an episode entirely about fandom, collecting, and the way a store full of plastic captures whatever is popular that month. Putting South Park merchandise on the clearance rack inside that episode would have been a prediction as much as a joke, suggesting the new thing would be discounted and forgotten soon enough. Swapping it for a line about Poochie changed the target from a competitor to the show's own most famous failure, which is a considerably better joke and a considerably more confident one. Whoever made that call improved the episode and removed a shot at a rival at the same time. The jokes kept coming afterward, and they generally got lighter as the years passed. In a 2013 episode called Gorgeous Grandpa, Mr. Burns works his way through a song listing figures he admires, and Eric Cartman turns up in it, appearing in silhouette. That is a nod rather than a shot, delivered with something close to affection, and it arrived a decade after the exchange that started all this. The timing makes the reply look even thinner. By the spring of 2003, the phrase from South Park's episode had already started circulating outside the fandom. People were using it in conversation. It had begun the slow drift toward becoming a stock line, which meant that a substantial part of the audience watching Springfield's cold open already knew the reference it was answering. That put The Simpsons in a position where anything it aired would be measured against a joke a good portion of the audience had memorized. A vague sketch was never going to survive that comparison, and the reaction it received reflected exactly that. There is one more piece of context that changes how the whole exchange reads, and it involves a completely different show. While Springfield was aiming a lazy sketch at South Park, it was aiming much sharper material at somebody else. In a Halloween episode broadcast in 2002, the same year South Park made its confession, The Simpsons filled the screen with a crowd of Homer clones and quietly placed Peter Griffin among them, suggesting that the lead character of Family Guy was simply another copy of Homer wearing different clothes. 3 years later, in an episode set in Italy, 2 police officers flip through a book of American criminals and land on a photograph of Peter Griffin with the Italian word for plagiarism printed underneath. That is a specific, repeated, deliberate accusation rather than a vague impression assembled from things people say, delivered twice, years apart, with the target named through image alone, which reframes the South Park sketch entirely. The Simpsons was perfectly capable of precision when it felt strongly about something. The vagueness of the Bart of War was not a limitation. It was an indication of how much energy the show was willing to spend. Springfield's real irritation lay elsewhere, pointed at a program that had launched in 1999 wearing a family structure almost identical to its own, and South Park simply was not in that category. Seen that way, the mismatched reply looks less like an insult and more like indifference, which in some ways is worse, and in other ways is far less interesting than a feud. There was no feud. There was a show doing a quick television joke about another show in a season where the writers were producing more than 20 episodes and could not devote devote much thought to any single cold open. By 2003, The Simpsons was 14 years into its run and producing on a schedule that left almost no room for that kind of care. It had already outlasted most of the programs that launched alongside it, had survived several complete turnovers of its writing staff, and was operating as an institution rather than an insurgent. Institutions do not usually spend much energy responding to compliments from smaller neighbors. Taken together, the whole sequence of events forms a strange picture: two shows sharing an audience, an industry, and a category, communicating with each other through jokes buried inside episodes about completely unrelated things. Neither one issued a statement, neither creator wrote an open letter. Everything went through the work, which is how television people tend to argue when they are arguing with other television people. There is also a practical reason the two shows kept talking through their episodes rather than through the press. Both were owned by large companies with a financial interest in keeping animated comedy healthy as a category. A public fight between two of the biggest cartoons on television would have generated headlines nobody in either building wanted and would have forced executives to get involved. A joke buried in a cold open costs nothing, reaches exactly the people who will understand it, and can be waved off as harmless if anybody asks. That is why so much of this history sits in background gags, chalkboards, and 2-second cameos rather than in interviews. The people making these shows were speaking to each other in a language their audiences could read, but their employers would never bother to translate. And the balance of that argument is worth stating plainly, because it explains why the story did not end here. South Park had made the generous move, publicly and at length, and got a dismissive sketch in return. The Simpsons had been handed a compliment and had answered with a shrug. What the exchange left behind was a lopsided record. South Park had studied Springfield closely enough to name 3 episodes and get every detail right. Springfield had answered with a sketch about a cartoon it did not appear to have watched. For a rivalry that everybody kept describing as evenly matched, only one side had ever done the reading. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. In the spring of 2006, South Park spent 2 full episodes attacking a rival cartoon, and one of the characters helping with the attack was drawn in yellow. What arrived at the South Park offices afterward proved exactly where Springfield had been standing the entire time. Section 8. The Manatees, the Flowers, and the Boy in Yellow, April 5, 2006. South Park is 3 episodes into its 10th season, and the one going out that night is called Cartoon Wars Part 1, written and directed by Trey Parker. It begins with the entire town in a panic. The reason for the panic is a cartoon. Word has spread that an animated program is about to broadcast an image of the Muslim Prophet Muhammad, and the residents of South Park are convinced that violence will follow. They crowd into the community center to hide. The cartoon in question turns out to be Family Guy, and the following morning everyone is relieved to learn that Fox censored the image at the last moment and nothing happened at all. The setup came out of something entirely real. A Danish newspaper had published cartoons depicting Muhammad in September 2005, and by early 2006, the response had spread across multiple countries, producing protests, boycotts, diplomatic incidents, and in some places, riots. Newsrooms and broadcasters around the world were making decisions about what they would and would not show, and most of them were choosing not to show anything. Parker and Stone had run into the same wall themselves with their own network, which is where the anger driving the episode came from. There is a detail underneath all of this that made the situation absurd for the people making South Park. The show had already depicted Muhammad years earlier without anybody objecting at all. A 2001 episode had assembled a team of religious figures into a superhero group, and Muhammad had been one of them, appearing on screen as an ordinary character among several others. The episode aired. Comedy Central had no problem with it. Nobody protested, nobody threatened anybody, and the episode went into rotation like everything else. The change between 2001 and 2006 happened outside the show entirely, in the environment around it. After the Danish cartoons, the same image that had passed without comment became something networks would not carry, and Parker and Stone found themselves being told they could not do a thing they had already done and had been allowed to do. That is the specific frustration powering the episode, and it explains the running gag about the townspeople burying their heads in sand pits. Faced with a threat they cannot control, the residents of South Park choose the most literal possible form of avoidance, sticking their heads into the ground so that nobody can accuse them of having watched anything. It is a joke about cowardice, dressed up as caution, and it is aimed squarely at the institution institutions that were making those decisions in real life. The network fight around the episodes was real as well. Comedy Central and its parent company were reluctant, and their stated concern was public safety rather than taste. The finished broadcast reflected that reluctance in a way viewers could see for themselves, since the moment of the depiction is handled with a title card rather than an image. Parker and Stone let the censorship happen on screen and made the censorship itself part of the story, which is a technique they would use again 4 years later under far more serious circumstances. But the episode is only half about that, and by the second half it becomes clear which half Parker actually cared about. Kyle believes the censorship was wrong on principle. Cartman argues the opposite, delivering a speech about protecting people from harm that sounds sincere and is completely fraudulent. Because Cartman does not care about the depiction, or about Muslims, or about anybody's safety, Cartman wants Family Guy taken off the air for an entirely personal reason. He is tired of people comparing his sense of humor to that show's sense of humor, and he has decided that the simplest solution is to have the show destroyed. That motive is the joke, and it is also a confession. Parker and Stone had spent years being grouped with a program they thought worked in a completely different way, and had said publicly that being praised as one half of that pair was among the most insulting compliments they had ever received. They put that exact grievance inside their most selfish character and let him run with it, which is a sharply self-aware move for a show that gets described as having no self-awareness at all. Part 2 aired a week later, on April 12th, and this is where the cameo happens. Cartman travels to the Fox studio lot in Los Angeles to stop the broadcast. Waiting for him there, drawn in South Park's paper cutout style, is Bart Simpson. Bart tells him he hates Family Guy too. The two of them size each other up and reach an agreement about which of them is better suited to manipulate a room full of executives, and they conclude that Cartman is by a comfortable margin the more evil and effective of the two. Bart's contribution is to intercept Kyle before he can interfere, knocking him out and locking him in a supply shed, which is exactly the kind of low-grade sabotage Bart Simpson has been carrying out since 1990. Later, Kyle talks him around, and Bart lets him go. The scene is played as Bart being worn down by one of Kyle's earnest speeches, rather than changing his mind, which is its own small joke about how both shows handle moral conclusions. What that cameo actually amounts to is worth spelling out. In 2002, South Park had built an entire episode around conceding that The Simpsons had done everything first. In 2006, South Park brought Bart Simpson into its own world as an ally, on the same side of an argument, working toward the same goal. He turns up as a collaborator rather than a target, and one who happens to be slightly less competent at being awful. Then Cartman gets his meeting, and the episode delivers the image everybody remembers. He is taken to see the writers of Family Guy, and the writers turn out to be manatees. A tank full of them, swimming slowly, nudging plastic balls into a machine. Each ball has a word or a name printed on it. The machine takes whatever combination of balls the animals happen to push in and assembles a joke out of them. The manatees are not writing anything. They are pushing objects around at random, and a device downstream converts the randomness into cutaway gags. The accusation buried in that image is precise, and it concerns construction rather than taste. The complaint is that the jokes have no relationship to anything around them. They could be inserted anywhere, in any order, in any episode, without changing a single thing, because they are not connected to character, story, or consequence. That is a specific position about how comedy should be built, and the place that position came from matters, because it is the same standard The Simpsons had operated under during the years everybody agrees were its best. Springfield's jokes at their peak grew out of who the characters were and what they wanted. Homer's stupidity produced consequences that produced more jokes. The itchy and scratchy segments commented on whatever the surrounding episode was about. A gag that could be lifted out and dropped into a different episode without loss was, by that standard, not doing its job. So in 2006, South Park went to war on behalf of a philosophy of comedy that The Simpsons had established, using an argument The Simpsons had been making quietly through background jokes for 4 years, with Bart Simpson standing in the scene helping. Springfield noticed. Parker and Stone have described what happened next several times, and the details stay consistent. After Cartoon Wars aired, the people who made The Simpsons sent flowers to the South Park offices. The gesture carried no message about the free speech argument and no comment about the network fight. Flowers sent in gratitude for going after Family Guy. The team behind King of the Hill called as well, and their message was blunter. Somebody on that staff told Parker and Stone that they were doing God's work by ripping on Family Guy. Parker has said since that he believes the King of the Hill people hated that show more than he and Stone ever did, said, even if they would not say so publicly. The shape of that reaction deserves a second. South Park had produced 2 episodes about censorship, terrorism, network cowardice, and religious depiction in the middle of an international news story that had produced actual violence. The reaction from inside the animation industry was almost entirely about the manatees. That reaction shows how much resentment had accumulated in those buildings by 2006, and it shows exactly where The Simpsons stood. Springfield had spent 4 years pointing at Family Guy through visual gags that most viewers never noticed. A Halloween crowd scene in 2002. A mugshot labeled with the Italian word for plagiarism in 2005. Small, deniable, buried. When somebody else finally said it out loud across 2 full episodes of television, the response was, "Gratitude delivered in a vase." The list of people who were not thanked matters just as much. Nobody sent flowers over the free speech argument. Nobody sent flowers over the depiction of network cowardice, which was aimed at a business every one of those writers worked inside. The industry response was narrow and specific, and it was about craft rather than politics. That narrowness is the tell. Writers do not get worked up about somebody else's philosophical position. Writers get worked up about method, because method is the thing they argue over every day in their own rooms. The gratitude flowing towards South Park in April 2006 was professional rather than ideological. It came from people who had spent years watching a rival succeed using an approach they considered lazy and who had never found a way to say so without sounding bitter. South Park found the way. Putting the accusation inside a tank of marine mammals turned a complaint that would have sounded petty in an interview into an image nobody could argue with, because there is no dignified response to being compared to a manatee. That is the craft difference the flowers were actually acknowledging. The other side did not respond with anything like that energy. Family Guy's staff addressed it mostly through their own commentary tracks, where they began referring to their own gags using the manatee comparison, absorbing the insult and wearing it. A more direct answer arrived on screen 3 years later, in a 2009 episode where Peter takes part in an improvised comedy show and finds that only his nonsensical material gets a laugh out of the crowd, which reads as a shrug rather than a counterattack. Seth MacFarlane, asked about it years later, said he found the episode funny and accurate and expressed genuine confusion only about the harsher personal comments Parker and Stone had made in interviews outside the context of a joke. He also noted that his crowd and the Simpsons crowd had grown friendly over time, which is its own quiet acknowledgement of who had been standing where. One further layer sits inside the Bart cameo, and it comes from where the scene takes place. Cartman does not meet Bart in Springfield, and Bart is not visiting Colorado. They meet on a studio lot in Hollywood, standing outside the offices where decisions about both of their shows get made. That location choice turns the scene into something other than a crossover. 2 animated children from 2 different networks, drawn in 2 different styles, standing in the one place where they are not characters at all but products belonging to companies. Whatever rivalry existed between the shows dissolves the moment they are both standing on somebody else's property, looking at the same executives. Bart siding with Cartman in that setting is the clearest statement in this entire history about who these 2 shows actually treated as the opposition, the people upstairs, rather than each other. The lasting significance of Cartoon Wars for this story is not the fight with Family Guy at all. It is what the episode reveals about the relationship underneath it. By 2006, South Park was not competing with The Simpsons. It was defending the same standard, using the same argument, with a Simpsons character physically present in the scene, and it received a public thank you from the show it had spent 2002 apologizing to. 4 years earlier, Butters had stood in a town square with a broken statue behind him, being told by a news reporter that his crime had been reclassified as a tribute. 4 years later, the show that made him did something that got read exactly the same way, and this time, the tribute was intentional. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 4 more years pass, and South Park reaches a milestone that only one other American cartoon had ever reached first. The congratulations that arrived from Springfield contained a joke so perfectly aimed that it works as the summary of this entire story, and it was sent days before both shows collided collided with something considerably less funny. Section 9. 200 episodes and a chalkboard. In the spring of 2010, South Park arrived at a number that almost no scripted American series ever reaches. 200 episodes, 13 full seasons, plus a feature film, plus more than a decade of production on a schedule that had once seemed impossible to sustain for a single year. A milestone like that produces a small pile of congratulations from around the industry, most of it forgettable. One message stood out, and it came from Springfield. The Simpsons crew sent word to South Park congratulating them on reaching 200 episodes. Then, in brackets, they added that they had already done it. Then, in a second set of brackets, they added that they had done it twice. It is a perfect piece of writing, and it works on every level available. It is warm. It is a joke every South Park fan would recognize instantly, since the exact phrase had been carrying that show's most famous episode for 8 years. It is a friendly acknowledgement that South Park had turned the accusation into a gift, and it is also completely, plainly true, which is what gives it teeth. By April 2010, The Simpsons was somewhere past its 450th episode. 200 had come and gone in the mid-90s. 400 had come and gone in 2007. The second parenthetical was arithmetic rather than exaggeration, delivered with a shrug. 200 episodes is a strange achievement to explain to anybody outside television, because the number sounds smaller than it is. Most scripted programs never get near it. Shows get canceled after 6 episodes, after 1 season, after a network changes management. Reaching 200 means surviving roughly a dozen years of schedule changes, cast negotiations, executive turnover, shifting audience habits, and the slow erosion that eventually catches almost everything. For South Park, it also meant surviving its own reputation. The show had been treated as a fad in 1998, as a cultural symptom in 1999, and as something that could not possibly sustain itself past the novelty of hearing children swear. 13 years later, it was still producing episodes in under a week, and still landing in the middle of national conversations. The only other American animated comedy that had ever been in a position to make that particular joke was the one that made it. That message also does something quietly generous that is easy to miss. By reaching for the South Park phrase, the older show was acknowledging that the phrase now belonged to South Park rather than to itself. The words describe The Simpsons, but the joke is South Park's property, and Springfield had to borrow it in order to make the point. The show that supposedly did everything first had to use somebody else's line to say so. That message went out days before both shows walked into the most serious situation either of them had ever faced. South Park's 200th episode aired on Comedy Central on April 14, 2010, written and directed by Trey Parker, and it was built as a deliberate accounting of the show's own history. Nearly every celebrity the program had insulted over 13 years returns at once, forming an angry mob and marching on the town with a single demand. They want the show to produce Muhammad because they believe he possesses something they can use. The mob is led by a film star the show had gone after years earlier in one of its most notorious episodes, and the crowd behind him is stacked with figures the program had insulted across more than a decade. A giant mechanical version of a singer the show had used as a monster back in its first season turns up as well. The whole thing is assembled out of grudges the show had spent 13 years collecting, brought back all at once, and pointed at the town that created them. Structurally, the episode is a victory lap. It pulls threads from years of earlier stories, brings back running characters, and treats the show's own back catalog as the material. A program that had spent 2002 worrying about whether it had any territory of its own, celebrated 200 episodes by demonstrating exactly how much territory it had accumulated. The story continued in episode 201, which aired the following week on April 21st. What happened to that episode is the part that matters here. Before broadcast, a website connected to a radical group posted a message aimed at Parker and Stone, framed as a warning and pointing to the fate of a filmmaker who had been killed in Europe years earlier over similar subject matter. The story was picked up widely and moved fast. Comedy Central responded by altering the episode substantially. Every spoken reference to Muhammad was bleeped out. Images were covered, and the alterations extended past the depiction itself into the closing minutes of the story, where the characters deliver a speech about intimidation and fear, which was obscured almost entirely. The network censored the thing that had drawn the threat, and then went further and censored the show's own argument about why threats should never be allowed to work. Parker and Stone did not sign off on those changes. The episodes were pulled from rotation afterward and have remained difficult to see through official channels ever since, which means the 200th and 201st episodes of one of the most widely available shows on television are among the hardest episodes of it to watch. There is a further wrinkle worth naming. The show had already worked worked out how to make censorship visible rather than invisible back during Cartoon Wars 4 years earlier, by putting a title card where an image should have been and letting the audience see the whole. What happened in 2010 removed that option, because the alterations were made after the episode left Parker and Stone's hands rather than negotiated in advance. That distinction matters. A creator who chooses to show the censorship keeps control of the meaning. A creator whose work is altered afterward loses it. The version of 201 that most people saw functioned as a censored episode rather than a statement about censorship, which is a completely different object. The critical reaction was intense and largely aimed at the network rather than the show. The common argument was that censoring a program in response to a threat guarantees more threats, since it demonstrates that the method works. Whatever anybody thought of South Park generally, a great many people who had never defended it before found themselves defending it that week. Both episodes went on to be nominated for the Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program that year. What made the situation hard for everyone watching from inside the industry was that there was no clean position available. Defending the broadcast meant defending material a great many people found offensive on its own terms. Defending the network meant accepting that a threat had successfully changed what appeared on American television. Most programs solved that by saying nothing at all, which was the safest option and also the least honest one. The people who did speak up tended to be comedians and writers rather than executives, and their arguments centered on precedent rather than content. Once a broadcaster demonstrates that pressure works, the pressure does not stop arriving. That was the concern, and it was raised loudly enough that the story ran for weeks after the episode itself had left the air. 4 days after 201 aired, on Sunday, April 25, 2010, The Simpsons broadcast the 19th episode of its 21st season, an episode called The Squirt and the Whale, written by Matt Warburton and directed by Mark Kirkland. It was the 460th episode of the series, and the story had nothing to do with any of this. The family finds a beached whale and tries to save it. The response was in the opening credits. The chalkboard slot deserves a moment of explanation, because its value comes entirely from what it usually contains. Since the first episode in 1989, the opening sequence has shown Bart writing a line over and over as punishment, and the line changes almost every week. For most of the show's history, it has been used for silly, self-contained gags about Bart's behavior, occasional jokes about the show itself, and the odd nod to whatever was happening in the world. It is also one of the few places in a Simpsons episode that can be changed late. Everything else in a broadcast has been locked for months by the time it airs, sitting inside an animation pipeline that starts close to a year ahead. The chalkboard is the one piece of the show that can respond to something that happened last week, which is exactly why it has been used across the decades to mark deaths, elections, sporting results, and network business. So when the writers wanted to say something about an event 4 days old, they had precisely one tool available, and they used it. Bart's chalkboard that week carried a message addressed directly to South Park, saying that Springfield would stand beside them if it were not so scared. That single line is one of the more remarkable things The Simpsons ever put in that slot, and it takes a moment to appreciate why. The obvious options were both available and both worse. The show could have written something defiant, which would have been posturing, since Fox was never going to let The Simpsons depict what South Park had tried to depict. Or it could have said nothing at all, which is what almost every other program in America did that week. Instead, the show chose to state its own position accurately and let the audience judge it. Solidarity, offered and immediately withdrawn in the same sentence, for the exact reason everybody already suspected. It is a joke, and it is also a confession, and the confession is what makes the joke land. There is a further layer in the wording that rewards a second look. The line does not say Springfield disagrees with South Park, and it does not say Springfield approves. It says only that the two would be standing together under different conditions. That leaves the actual argument untouched and puts the entire weight of the sentence on the speaker rather than the subject. Most public statements made during that week did the opposite. They took a position on speech, or on religion, or on network responsibility, and used a great many words to do it. The chalkboard skipped all of that and reported a single fact about its own state of mind. There is a reason that line is still quoted 16 years later, and almost none of the editorials from that week are. That move resembles what South Park had done in 2002 more closely than it first appears. Faced with an uncomfortable truth truth about itself, one show built an episode around admitting it. Faced with an uncomfortable truth about itself, the other show wrote it on a blackboard in front of 10 million people. Neither one denied anything. Neither one issued a statement full of careful language. Both handled the problem by saying the awkward thing out loud, in the form of a joke, inside the work itself. There is a final detail attached to that chalkboard that completes the picture almost too neatly. The message did not air everywhere. A number of stations carried an alternate gag instead, an unrelated line in French with no connection to South Park at all. So a joke about being too frightened to stand beside somebody was, in some markets, replaced because somebody was frightened to air it. The gag proved its own point on the way to the screen. Nobody planned that. It simply happened, the way these things do when caution is running through every level of an organization at once. Put together, that whole week made the shape of the relationship visible in a way it never quite had been before. For 13 years, the connection between these two shows had been described as a rivalry by nearly everybody writing about them. The newer show was supposedly the challenger, the older show was supposedly the establishment, and every comparison had been framed as a competition with a winner and a loser somewhere in it. What actually happened in April 2010 was that one show sent the other a congratulatory joke about its own longevity, and then, when that show came under genuine pressure, the older one used the most visible piece of real estate it owns to say something honest about it. No competition anywhere in that sequence. Two long-running programs working in the same medium under the same commercial pressures, treating each other as colleagues. The congratulation and the chalkboard arrived inside the same fortnight. Between them sat a censored episode, an international news story, and a real question about what a network will and will not put on television when somebody objects loudly enough. It is also the moment where the older show's position in this whole history becomes clearest. For 20 years, The Simpsons had been the thing everybody else was measured against, the catalog nobody could get past, the institution that had claimed the ground before anyone else arrived. That position comes with an obligation nobody ever writes down, which is that the institution is expected to behave like one. Institutions do not usually admit fear on television. They release statements, or they stay quiet and wait for the news cycle to move. What Springfield did instead was tell the truth about its own limits in 11 words, on a blackboard, in a slot normally reserved for jokes about skateboarding. The story of these two shows had started with one of them accidentally occupying every idea the other one wanted. It ended up somewhere entirely different, and the distance between those two positions is the thing that makes the whole history worth telling. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Everything after 2010 turns into a long exchange of nods, cameos, and buried jokes running in both directions. Right up to the year one show sent a beloved character to live in the other show's town. Where he ended up and who welcomed him says more about both programs than any of the arguments ever did. Section 10, What It Left Behind. Everything after 2010 runs at a much lower temperature, and the jokes flow in both directions with no particular urgency behind any of them. The earliest of the friendly ones actually arrived a few months before the chalkboard. In December 2009, The Simpsons aired an episode written by Matt Selman and directed by Stephen Dean Moore, in which Bart, Milhouse, Nelson, and Ralph turn up at a bus stop wearing the outfits of the four South Park boys. Bart takes Stan, Milhouse takes Kyle, Nelson takes Cartman, and Ralph takes the orange hooded coat. Otto drives the school bus straight into Ralph and announces that he has killed Kenny, which is the single most quoted line in South Park's history. Milhouse corrects him, pointing out that the boy on the ground is Ralph. Otto clarifies that he knows, and that he killed Kenny yesterday. That gag is doing something a little more careful than it first appears. It uses the catchphrase, gets the costumes right, and then adds a second beat that only works if the writer understands the original joke well enough to break it. Kenny dying is the setup, not the punchline. Somebody in that room had actually watched the show, which had not always been true of Springfield's South Park material. In 2014, the 25th annual Halloween special included a segment built around alternate versions of the Simpson family arriving at the house, drawn in the styles of other animation traditions. One of those versions is rendered in South Park's cutout style, with Bart in Stan's hat, Lisa in Kyle's hat, and Maggie designed to resemble the show's Canadian characters. No joke is attached to it beyond the recognition itself. It is a costume change, placed alongside a lineup of other animation history, treating South Park as one of the established visual languages of the medium rather than as a rival. Then, in February 2017, in an episode called The Cad and the Hat, the couch gag turned into a small tour. The sailboat painting that has hung on the Simpsons wall since 1989 goes missing, and Homer sets off through the worlds of other animated shows looking for it. One of the stops is South Park, which Homer describes as looking like a third-grade diorama, and the boys respond to his question by swearing at him continuously while every word gets bleeped. He moves on, passes through another piece of animation history, and finds the painting in the hands of a character from a stop-motion series before the gag pays off, with Marge letting out a bleeped word of her own. Even that stop is respectful in its way. The insult about the diorama is accurate rather than cruel, since the show's construction paper look was always a deliberate choice, and the bleeping joke is South Park's own joke about itself. Taken together, those moments show a clear change in how Springfield handled the subject. In 2003, the show had aired a sketch about a version of South Park that did not exist, built out of things people said about it. By 2009, it was getting the catchphrase right and then building a second joke on top of it. By 2014, it was treating the show as a recognized animation style worth including in a lineup of them. By 2017, it was sending Homer through South Park's world as one stop on a tour of animation history. That is a 14-year progression from dismissal to familiarity to something close to respect, carried out entirely through background jokes that lasted a few seconds each. The traffic in the other direction produced one final crossover, and it is the most complicated moment in this entire history. In October 2018, South Park aired an episode carrying Trey Parker's name on both the script and the direction, and its title played on a documentary that had come out the previous year examining a long-running Simpsons character and the way that character had been received by Indian audiences in America. That documentary had put The Simpsons under real public pressure, and the show's own response to it had been widely criticized as dismissive. South Park's episode is about its own version of the same problem. The town turns against Mr. Hankey, a character who had been part of the show since its first Christmas episode, after his behavior becomes impossible to defend. The town votes him out. Stripped of his place in South Park, he goes looking for somewhere that will still have him. He ends up in Springfield, where he is welcomed with open arms by the very character the documentary had been about. That is a sharp joke, and there is no way to read it as gentle. It puts Springfield forward as the place where things that can no longer survive elsewhere go to be accepted, and it does so at the precise moment The Simpsons was struggling with exactly that accusation in public. It is also, structurally, the same move South Park had been making since 2002. Springfield remains the reference point. Springfield remains the place a character goes when the story needs somewhere older and larger and more permanent than South Park itself. Even at its most pointed, South Park keeps positioning The Simpsons as the institution, which is what it had been doing all along. The clearest sign of how far things had traveled is that none of these later references needed a reason. Earlier jokes between the two shows had always been answering something. By the middle of the 2010s, they had stopped answering anything and turned into the kind of casual acknowledgement one long-running program gives another simply because both happen to still be there. More nods arrived after that. A Halloween special in 2022 included a sequence listing invented worlds, and South Park turned up on the list among them, thrown in as one more piece of scenery. By that point, the reference required no setup at all. Two long-running cartoons acknowledging each other had become so routine that it barely registered as a joke, closer to two neighbors waving from opposite driveways. That routine quality is itself the ending of the story. Whatever heat existed in 2002 and 2003 had cooled so completely by the 2020s that references between the shows stopped carrying any charge. Nobody watching a Simpsons Halloween special in 2022 read a South Park mention as a comment on anything. It was simply there, the way a mention of any other long-standing piece of television furniture would be. Both shows are still running. The Simpsons has passed well beyond 700 episodes and continues producing seasons. South Park has passed 300 episodes, signed enormous streaming deals, and shifted a portion of its output into feature-length specials while continuing to turn episodes around at a speed nobody else in animation attempts. Between them, they have occupied American television for more than 3.5 decades, and almost every animated comedy that launched alongside either of them is gone. Which brings this back to the thing the whole story has been circling. The Simpsons was right about South Park in 4 separate ways, and each one is larger than the last. It was right that it got there first. That is the smallest of the 4, and it is the only one anybody usually mentions. The show occupied the territory before the competition arrived, and South Park conceded that publicly, at length, in an episode written and directed by its own creator. It was right that getting there first does not matter. This is the one that took a whole episode to arrive at and that most people miss entirely. The Simpsons never claimed to invent anything. It built its Halloween specials out of Twilight Zone episodes and horror novels, built its most famous running feature out of cartoons from the 1940s, built its best-loved episode out of a stage musical from the 1950s, and built its most famous cliffhanger out of a primetime drama from 1980. It competed on execution, and it won on execution, which is the only place any comedy has ever won. That second point is the one worth holding on to, because it explains why the fear was so misplaced in the first place. The sun-blocking machine works as an example. Somebody had already written a story about a rich man darkening the sky over a town, long before 1995, in one form or another. The idea of a villain stealing the daylight is older than television and older than film. What made the Springfield version work was Mr. Burns himself, his particular frailty and pettiness, his relationship with Smithers, the specific way the town reacted, and the 6 seasons of history that made the moment land. Stripped of all that, the premise is nothing. A machine that blocks the sun is a sentence rather than a joke. Everything that makes it memorable is the material built around it, and that material cannot be taken by anybody because it belongs to the characters rather than the concept. Which means South Park could have blocked out the sun in 2000 and nobody would have confused the two, provided the version they built was made of Cartman rather than made of the idea. The overlap that had frightened the room was an overlap of premise, and premise is the least valuable part of any comedy anybody has ever written. It was right about how comedy should be built. 4 years after the concession episode, South Park spent 2 full episodes making that argument on national television, and the reward was a delivery of flowers from Springfield. 2 shows that had spent a decade being described as rivals turned out to hold identical opinions about what a joke is supposed to be attached to. There is something almost funny about how thoroughly that agreement was hidden from everyone at the time. Through the late 90s and early 2000s, an enormous amount of writing treated these 2 programs as opposites. One was warm, one was cruel, one was for families, one was for teenagers. One belonged to the establishment, one was tearing the establishment down. Entire columns were built on the contrast. Underneath all of that, the 2 rooms held the same opinion about the single question that actually matters to a comedy writer, which is whether a joke has to be attached to something. Both said yes, both said it loudly, and neither audience noticed because they were too busy arguing about swearing, and it was right about itself. When the pressure arrived in 2010, The Simpsons did not pretend to be braver than it was. It said, in public, on a blackboard, that it was frightened. That is a harder thing to be right about than any of the others. There is one last piece, and it closes the loop in a way nobody could have designed. The phrase itself escaped, and the timing of that escape matters. The episode aired in 2002, when the internet was still a place people visited rather than lived in, and the joke stayed inside the fandom for years. In 2010, somebody uploaded the specific exchange to a video site, stripped of context, running about 10 seconds. From there, it spread the way short clips spread, into image macros, into comment threads, into replies. Simpsons did it, stopped being a line from a television episode, and became something people say. It turns up in arguments about films, about music, about technology, about politics. It gets used by people who have never seen the episode it came from, and by people who have never watched either show, as shorthand for the idea that any thought a person has just had already exists somewhere. A joke about being unable to escape The Simpsons became one of the most repeated pieces of language either show ever produced, and it did so by leaving both of them behind entirely. Which is exactly what happened to Butters. He cut the head off a statue as an act of defiance, and the town looked at it and called it a tribute, and decided to leave it that way permanently. Trey Parker built an episode out of frustration at being told somebody else had done everything first, and the culture took that episode, agreed with it, and turned the complaint into a permanent monument to the show he was complaining about. And that outcome is not a defeat for anybody. Butters ends his episode cured, cheerful, and entirely free of the thing that had been strangling him. South Park went on to produce another 20 years of television without ever worrying about the question again. The Simpsons went on doing what it had always done, which is take whatever is lying around and make it specific enough to belong to Springfield. The only thing that died in the whole story was the idea that any of it mattered, and that idea deserved to die. One last thought about why this particular argument has survived so long when almost every other feud between animated shows has been forgotten. Most television rivalries are about status. Who is bigger? Who is funnier? Who is winning the time slot? Those arguments date badly because the answer changes every few years and nobody cares about the ratings from a Tuesday in 1999. This one was about something that does not date at all. Every person who has ever tried to write, draw, film, or build anything has stood exactly where Butters stood, holding an idea they were proud of, and discovered that somebody got there first. That feeling has not changed since long before either show existed and will not change afterward. What The Simpsons demonstrated across more than 3 decades and hundreds of episodes is that the feeling is real and the conclusion drawn from it is wrong. Being second is the normal condition. Everybody is second. The work is in what happens next. The statue is still standing. Nobody is planning to fix it. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next video.